Okay, US2 students, this is your professor, Dr. Dave Nelson, with our first lecture. This one's going to be on Reconstruction. Before we get started, since this is the first online lecture you're doing, a couple of quick things. Hopefully my voice comes out okay. I apologize in advance that you're having to listen to me like this. I couldn't imagine having to sit through this. Feeling very awkward right now. I'm sitting in my house with this huge headset on by myself, talking out loud. Very awkward situation. I'm used to doing this in the classroom. Again, before we get started, I want to really encourage you to do a couple of things. One is wherever you are, whether you're at home or in the library or somewhere in the car listening to this on your phone, please don't do that. But try to take this seriously. Try to pretend you're actually in a classroom. Hopefully you have something to write, a space to write. You have a pen or a pencil and a notebook. Please try to actually take notes. For one thing, you don't want to have to listen to this more than once. But I'm very old-fashioned. I do believe in lecturing. I think lecturing works, at least for history. And I really do think that taking notes helps you remember this stuff. Not only do you have to put the material into your own words, because during this PowerPoint, like you see now, there are words on the screen, but a lot of this is going to be me talking. And sometimes you need to be able to take what I say and condense it down into your own words. And in doing that, that's going to help you learn the material and remember it for the quizzes and exams. It's like when you go grocery shopping. I did this 2 days ago. If you just look in your kitchen and then go grocery shopping, you forget half of what you needed. But if you write it down and then you go, you will remember all of it. Now, often I don't even look at my grocery list because by writing it down, that made me remember it. So I feel the same way about note-taking. So please, I hope you're, again, taking notes and all that. Okay, enough of that. And by the way, if as we go along, if it gets hard to hear or if the sound goes out, because I don't like to listen to myself, I don't usually listen to these once I record them, be sure to let me know. Email me or let me know in the classroom, because I may need to re-record some of these or fix some sort of technical error. And again, feel free to pause it whenever you need to. Go back. I'm trying to go pretty fast because, again, I know you can pause it to take notes. So I'm not going to go as slow as I usually do in the classroom to give you time to write it down because, again, you can pause it. All right. Finally, Reconstruction. Let's get started. If you look at the image on the screen, I usually ask the class to tell me what's going on here. So look at that image for a moment. Even hit pause for a moment, maybe, and try to guess what's going on. You have a line of people. Looks like they're all African American. One's even in a U.S. Army uniform. There's an American flag fluttering above. You see a white bearded man, and you see these weird bottle-looking things. And somebody looks like they're putting something in that. What do you think that is? This is an image from a magazine called Harpers Weekly that was big in the 1860s and 1870s. This was on the front cover of that magazine. And if you look really close at the bottom of the screen, it'll tell you what it is. It says, "The First Vote." These are African Americans voting for the first time. Think about that for a moment. In this country, from the beginning of our country until 1865, we had slavery. And in this country, slavery was race-based. In other words, if you were white, you were free. If you were black, you were a slave. These people were considered property. Not just that they were slaves, but they were actually legally considered property. People with absolutely, completely no rights. And yet here they are, just barely after the Civil War. And not only are they free, not only are they citizens, they're getting to vote. There were a lot of people in this country that couldn't do what they're doing right then. Think about what allows you to vote right now. What are the requirements of voting? Pretty much over 18, American citizen, registered, you can vote. Back then, that wasn't the case. You had to be over 21. You had to be white. You had to be a male. So the fact that African American males, we have to be clear about that, women, still couldn't vote. Women wouldn't get to vote till 1920. So half this country couldn't vote until 1920. And yet here are people who used to be property voting. This was a shocking image. This was a revolutionary image. It was an image that made some people happy, but frankly, made a lot of people very unhappy, and not just Southerners. A lot of people thought we might have been going too far. Anyway, that image, I think, encapsulates what Reconstruction is actually about. It deals with race, but it's also about democracy and power. Voting is power. And this is the country, for the first time, beginning to share that power with other people. White men now, for the first time, sharing that power with other people. And there's going to be fighting over that right there. Again, this is really what Reconstruction is all about. I call this unfinished business because Reconstruction was never finished. In fact, what Reconstruction accomplished pretty much went away soon after Reconstruction. By the way, before I go any further, you've probably been told about Reconstruction in high school and elementary school and all that. It's always one of the most boring topics. I never liked it either. But most of what people are taught is usually wrong. We're going to see that Reconstruction may not be quite what you thought it was. I'm recording this in June 2015. And as we know now, there's been a lot of racial problems, even just recently. We clearly have a problem with race in this country. It's not as bad as it once was, but we still have problems with race. Yet, and we can date the beginning of those problems right here in Reconstruction. If Reconstruction had worked, we wouldn't even have a civil rights movement. But it didn't work. And we're going to see why it didn't work. This is, again, it's a failed program. It was unfinished business. So, what is Reconstruction? Just so here is, you can even pause it so you get it. This is Reconstruction. Took place starting in 1865, the end of the Civil War. That's the official start. And it ran until 1877. So about 12 years this ran. Although, as we'll see, most of it happened within about 5 years. The last few years, not much was going on. The definition is the physical, economic, social, and political rebuilding of the South after the Civil War by the federal government. It really is the first true federal government program, major federal government program. And at first, it was a success. In fact, the physical and economic actually was accomplished. In fact, the South comes out better after Reconstruction than it was before the Civil War. And that may be something you've never been told before. I've had students over the years tell me just the opposite. Not only were all the roads rebuilt, railroads rebuilt, bridges rebuilt, telegraph wires put on, but the South actually had thousands of miles of roads, telegraph wires, and railroads added to the infrastructure during Reconstruction. So the physical was done. Now, some private homes may not have been rebuilt, but generally speaking, physically, it worked. Economically, it took a while, but by 1880, the South was doing better than it had been doing in 1860 when the war began. So within 20 years, which is pretty amazing, within 20 years, economically, the South is back where it was. Here's the problem, though. Before the Civil War, most people in the South, black and white, were extremely poor. Only a few people actually had money. And that would remain the case after 1880. So we had problems with poverty before the war, and we are going to still have problems with poverty after the war. But you can't blame that on Reconstruction. Reconstruction took them back to where they began. So this story is really about the social and political rebuilding. That's what this is really all about. And it's really about race, democracy, money, and power. That's what this is really about. However, even though we officially started in 1865 with the ending of the Civil War, we can really see early attempts at Reconstruction before. When countries go to war, including the U.S., most people don't think about what happens after the war, once you're done. And yet, as a historian, not only is this what I'm interested in, but this is what I think is important. Why do you go to war to begin with? And hopefully you've covered in US 1 why we went to war, which is basically slavery. And then what do you do when the war is over with? I would argue that Reconstruction is one of the most important parts of a war, if not the most important part of a war. For instance, again, this is summer 2015. We still have troops in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, although for the most part we've left Iraq, but we still have advisors in Iraq. The war on terror ended 10 years ago, officially, but yet we're still there. We're still fighting. That's because we're in the Reconstruction period. The Reconstruction period usually is 2 to 3 times longer than the actual war, and you can see that in every war. So, but like most countries, including us, when the Civil War began, everybody talked about why it started, and everybody talked about how to win the war, but nobody, Confederates or the federal government, thought about what to do when the war was over. So soon after the war began, suddenly the federal government realized it's going to have a huge problem on its hands. This is a photo from Stono Island, South Carolina. That island, like many of these islands, had slaves. Most islands in Georgia, Florida, the Carolinas, usually had 1 or 2 major plantations on them. And so when the war began, one of the things the federal government tried to do was take all those islands, all those barrier islands, including this one. When the federal government arrived, the U.S. Army arrived, there was a big plantation that had over 1,000 slaves. And all they found was one overseer, all the owners had run away, and about 1,000 slaves. And suddenly the U.S. Army didn't know what to do with them. This is early Civil War. They didn't know whether these people are still going to be slaves. Are they still property? Where are they going to go? Who's going to feed them? What do we do with them? And in fact, the Army initially called them contraband. But the Army realized, oh my gosh, when we win this war, what are we going to do with all these slaves? There were 4 to 5 million slaves in the South. What are we going to do with them all? And suddenly the federal government, people like Abraham Lincoln and the U.S. Congress realized we got to come up with some plans. We got to deal with this. And so we can see the early versions of Reconstruction right from the beginning of the war, because again, suddenly people realize there's going to be some major issues. So from 1861-62 till 1865, we sometimes refer to this as Lincoln's Reconstruction. President Abraham Lincoln, the president during the war, as you guys hopefully already know. In April of 1865, once the war was over with, he was assassinated. So he never really was around during Reconstruction. And we really don't know what he would have done had he been alive. We can all guess, but we really don't know what he would have done. Would he done things differently? Would he done them the same? But we do know what he did during the war. So for instance, early in the war, 1862, New Orleans and most of Louisiana was taken by the federal government, major part of the Civil War. And so this gave the federal government and Lincoln a place to experiment a little bit with what we could do. So one thing that Lincoln did was he did something called the 10% plan. As you guys may know, Abraham Lincoln, as president, kept saying that all he wanted to do was stop the war. He did eventually free the slaves, but if he could have stopped the war without freeing the slaves, he would have done it. He was very clear about that. He just wanted to end the war. He didn't want to be about punishment. Now again, after the war, he may not have been that way, but during the war, that's what he said. So he was trying to come up with ways to get the South to stop fighting and come back. So 10% plan was part of that. What the 10% plan said was this: if 10% of the voting public votes to come back to the Union, then the entire state will be accepted back into the Union. Think about that for a moment. 10% of the voting public. That means white males over the age of 21 who have registered, which isn't a huge amount of people anyway. On top of that, it's only 10% of that. Most of my classes usually have 25 people. And they usually, at Bainbridge College, it tends to be more females than males. So in an average class, I'll have maybe 8 to 10 males in a classroom. Most of them are going to be between the ages of 18 and 20. So usually in an average classroom, I only have 2 to 3 people that could have voted. And on top of that, Only 10% of those 2 or 3 people would have decided. So if the classroom was a state, you see that really very few people actually would make this decision. This is extremely lenient. 90% of the people could say, hell no, we're never coming back. But if 10% says we're coming back, we're coming. So obviously this is just a nice way to get states back. It's a very lenient way to forgive states. It was a rehearsal for Reconstruction, as a historian has phrased it a few years ago. Now, they still weren't sure what to do with slaves yet, but there was one plan. You notice on the screen, it says Field Order Number 15. Field order is something that a general or an officer will do when they're on the ground. They have to make a quick decision, and they're called field orders. Okay, we're going to do this, So General Sherman, was trying to deal with this issue of what do we do with all these African Americans on these barrier islands like Stono? What do we do with them? There's too many, we can't take them, but they need to take care of themselves. How do we do that? So the plan was that they were going to take these islands and give them to the former slaves that lived on these islands. Just give it to them. And the army divided the islands up into 40-acre plots and gave one plot to each family to farm. And when they first initiated this, the U.S. Army happened to have a few mules. And so right at the beginning, they gave some of the families mules to help them out. And that's it. Some of you probably already recognize this. Some of you may have heard the phrase 40 acres and a mule. That's supposed to be the promise of the federal government that every former slave would get 40 acres and a mule. That's not true. The government never, ever actually promised that. Field Order Number 15 was just simply a quick way to give, to solve a problem. It was never meant to be total, complete policy. But it turned into this urban legend of what the federal government was going to do. So we're going to come back to this in a moment, because those families will not hang on to those islands for long. Another part of early Reconstruction was the Emancipation Proclamation. I'm sure everyone listening to this has heard this before. This was, of course, the attempt by the president, Abraham Lincoln, to free the slaves. In fact, that's what we always say. Abraham Lincoln was the great emancipator. He's the guy who freed the slaves, and he did it with the proclamation. It's not completely true. By the way, this is a power that presidents do have. They can proclaim things. Most of the time, presidents do very simple things like proclaim a day to be National Potato Day or something like that. But occasionally, they can do bigger stuff. And Abraham Lincoln was able to do this because he was commander-in-chief. We were at war, which gave him extraordinary powers. So he used those powers. So he proclaimed slaves to be free. But only those slaves in the rebelling states. There were 4 states that didn't rebel: Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, Delaware. All 4 of those were slave states. They were part of the Union. Also, Virginia split up during the war and became Virginia and West Virginia. And so there's really 5 states. And this also didn't say that any other state, like, say, California or Illinois, couldn't one day become a slave state. So this was a very specific thing for the war. Now, eventually, Abraham Lincoln will come up with the 13th Amendment that he writes and gets passed through Congress. If you've seen the Spielberg movie Lincoln, that's what that's all about. So Lincoln will free all the slaves, but he doesn't do it with this. This was an attempt to try to end the war quickly. And if you take US 1, we get more into the background of this, but we don't need to go there today. And so this freed some of the slaves, but not all slaves. It didn't completely solve the problem. Also notice it says effective 1st of January, 1863. He issues this in September of 1862. It could have been immediate, but it isn't. There's several months from when he issued this to when it becomes effective. You might ask yourself, why? Well, there's a specific reason why that's the case. What a lot of you don't realize is that within this, it actually said that if a state, let's say Georgia, if a state decided to come back to the Union before January 1st, 1863, they could. And if they did it, they could keep their slaves. So as you can see, this proclamation wasn't really about slavery. It was really about ending the war. However, nobody did that. And after January 1st, 1863, any Confederate land that was taken back by the government, the slaves on that land would be freed. So this complicates the end of the war. This is a huge part of Reconstruction. So Emancipation Day, that's in other words, the day that slaves were freed. For some people, it was January 1st, 1863, in places like Louisiana or Tennessee. But for most African Americans, Emancipation Day didn't happen until spring and summer of 1865. For instance, Southwest Georgia, where we're at, or North Florida, where I actually live, it would have been end of April, early May. In fact, Tallahassee, May 1st every year, Tallahassee still celebrates Emancipation Day. Other areas, it was much later, because it was whenever the Army came in when slaves were freed. So, for instance, in Texas, it wasn't until June. Texas had actually the last fighting of the war. So some places it was like June 15th, some places it was June 16th, June 17th. So a lot of people in Texas just kind of referred to it as just Juneteenth. So Juneteenth, most of you probably haven't heard this before, but Juneteenth is kind of a nickname for Emancipation Day. And for years and years and years, people would just call this day Juneteenth. And for generations, African Americans and other Americans would celebrate Emancipation Day. This is what you see here is an early version of it. This next slide is from 1905, and this is in Richmond, Virginia, celebrating Emancipation Day. So, again, we're talking 40 years later, and yet people are still celebrating it. Around the time of World War II, Emancipation Day celebrations began to kind of dissipate, but, so for many people, including African Americans, obviously this is what the war was about. And obviously we talk about the Civil War being a defeat for the South. Well, only defeat for some of the South. Some of the South, this was a victory, and this is a good example of that. But again, this is going to complicate matters. Also, what happens before the war completely ends is something called the U.S. Freedmen's Bureau. Freedmen, the old term for former slaves. Today we would say Freed People's Bureau, but freedmen just referring to those former slaves. If you were a slave, you would not, officially speaking, you would not have known how to read. Obviously, some slaves did know how to read, but legally you were not allowed to know how to read. You were not educated. You've been brought up your whole life to think of yourself as property. You didn't know anything about money, jobs, salaries, voting, government. I mean, you had to be taught all this. I mean, again, some people knew this stuff, but most people didn't. And so suddenly, you're free. What do you do? Where do you go? How do you function in society? So that's what this government program that Lincoln set up was all about, was to help these former slaves be brought into society. It's a good idea, Otherwise, you got 5 million people out of work. So a lot of people don't like the Freedmen's Bureau, in the past. In fact, if you read old history books, they always talk about the Freedmen's Bureau being very corrupt. And most of these are written by former Southern leaders who resented this program. There was some corruption, just like there is in all government programs. But by and large, it was a pretty honest, fair program. But there were some in the South that didn't like this program. Think about it. You're a landowner. You're a factory owner. You are used to having a workforce that not only do you not pay them, you own them. Now you have had to free these people, and now you got to pay these people. And this government program is going to step in and make sure you pay everybody a fair wage. You're not going to be very happy with this program. And a lot of people weren't. So again, accusations of corruption and all that. But again, the historical record does not bear that out. So some of the things that they did, they set up schools and churches, because again, obviously there was very few public schools in the South. Georgia didn't have a public school system until 1873. So there weren't even public school systems for white Georgians, let alone for African Americans. So they set up schools for blacks and whites, by the way, not just blacks. They set up churches. They helped reunite family members. In fact, if you're doing African American history, or if you're African American and you're doing your family history, these records are really important because they reveal a lot about where people are from and stuff. But again, their main task was to get these people hired and to develop labor contracts. Again, imagine you were a slave. Now you're free. And you're probably going to be working on the same plantation that you were a slave for, but now you got to get paid. But what do you get paid? What's a fair salary? You don't know. So you go to the landowner and you say, okay, I need a job. And the landowner says, okay, I'll pay you $25 a year. To you, that may seem like a good deal. You think, okay, that's a great deal. But of course, you just got ripped off. That's what the Freedmen's Bureau did. They came in and said, okay, that's unfair. There should be a fair wage paid. Again, it's a good idea, but you can see why Southern landowners, who were also the Southern politicians, who were also the Southern generals, in other words, the guys who started the Civil War, these guys aren't very happy with the Freedmen's Bureau. And eventually they'll get it shut down. That's why it only lasted 1872. It should have lasted at least 10 more years, but it will get shut down in 1872. But this was something that was started before the war ended and would continue into Reconstruction. And actually, this is one of the last things Lincoln did before he was assassinated. Before we go any further, because as you can tell, what Reconstruction is really about is a power struggle. And people like poor blacks and poor whites just kind of get tossed about between these Southern leaders and the federal government. So let's stop for a moment and talk a little bit about these freed people, these former slaves. The title of this slide says, quote, neither Nat Turners nor Uncle Toms. That's a quote from a historian. If you know your history, you might remember Nat Turner led a slave rebellion in 1831 in Virginia. Over 100 white Virginians were killed, the most violent slave rebellion in our history. And it scared a lot of people, even people who didn't like slavery. They were scared of Nat Turner. The fear was if African Americans are freed, they're all going to jump up and slit our throats in revenge. But African Americans obviously didn't do that, so they weren't Nat Turners. But they also weren't Uncle Toms. Uncle Tom comes from Uncle Tom's Cabin, a novel by Harriet Beecher Stowe, an anti-slavery novel. But if you read the novel, by the way, today, it's not a very good novel. It is kind of racist. Stowe didn't mean to be racist, but it actually is. And the character of Uncle Tom has kind of developed into this stereotype of an African American who sucks up to white people to get good favor. If you're Uncle Tomming, again, that means you're sucking up to white people. And that's obviously what most African Americans were not either. So they weren't violent, slitting people's throats, seeking revenge. In other words, they weren't the Django Unchained, but they also want Uncle Toms. So what did free peoples actually want? Well, number one is, even though they knew they were going to have to live often on the same plantations and work the same jobs, they didn't want to live exactly the same way. Many of them didn't want to live on the plantation anymore. They often moved. And if they did work on the same plantation, they often built their own homes. Or in some cases, this image, by the way, is from Live Oak, Florida. And what they did in this image is they actually took the slave cabin, they deconstructed it, they moved it about 100 feet, and then they rebuilt it. That seems like a weird thing to do, but the idea was you decided where it was. This is yours now. So there was a recognition that we want to be treated differently than we're slaves. They obviously wanted to be paid for what they did. And they wanted respect. And I know that's kind of a loose word. Let me give you an example of what I mean by respect. If you were a slave, let's say you're a husband or a wife and you got kids, you have no control over your family. The owner can tell you, your wife, your kids, when and where to work. After slavery was ended, because again, this is pre-1920, this is a time when women did not have rights. Of course, legally speaking, the husband was the head of the household. So black men said, my boss cannot tell my wife to work. My boss cannot tell my children that they have to work. I can do it. I can make that decision, but my boss cannot make that decision. I will make that decision. And so that's part of what we mean by respect. In other words, they're beginning to assert their rights as freed people. Notice I'm not saying citizens yet, but as freed peoples. And perhaps in many ways, what they wanted most of all was education. I would argue that there is no group that wanted education as much as freed peoples did in 1865, 66, 1867. It's a very famous image from 1873. This is a painting of a former slave learning to read for the first time. And that's almost, if not more, revolutionary than the image of African Americans voting. Because think about what you can read now. You can read the Bible. You can read newspapers. You can read the Constitution. A Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. Things that say phrases like, all men are created equal. Again, knowledge is power. And for the first time, African Americans have that power. So once the Civil War actually ends, unfortunately, Lincoln is assassinated. His vice president, Andrew Johnson, now becomes president. Andrew Johnson is an interesting character. I think you have some homework about him as well. He was from Tennessee, a southern state. He was a senator. He was a slave owner. But he was the only member of Congress, the only Southern member of Congress who did not rebel. He was a slave owner. He liked slavery, but he believed in the U.S. more than he believed in slavery. So ironically, Tennessee seceded from the Union, but he stayed in Congress. He was a congressman without a state. So he stayed in Congress, even though his state left. Since 1864, Lincoln's trying to get reelected. He knew he needed a Southerner on his side when the war was over with. So he ditched his first vice president and added Andrew Johnson to be his vice president. They didn't know each other very well. They didn't actually like each other. Andrew Johnson really had nothing to do with Lincoln. He was just vice president. Of course, nobody knew Lincoln was going to get killed. Lincoln's now dead. Johnson is now president. I couldn't imagine being the person to follow Lincoln, but that's Johnson. And Johnson does not do a very good job of it. So Johnson doesn't really know what to do. He's a white Southerner. He's a former. He did eventually free his slaves, by the way. He kind of had to do it, politically speaking. So he is a former slave owner, a Southerner, who wants to do right by his government, but he also wants to make sure he takes care of his friends and families. So he does what he thinks he's supposed to do. He does what Lincoln did during the war. So he initiates the 10% plan, a very lenient plan to bring states back. And so by fall of 1865, all the southern states have been accepted back into the Union. He also said, okay, if any former Confederate, and I want to stop here for a moment before I go any further. I'm going to make a couple of you mad by saying this. I want you to think about what it meant to be a Confederate. I'm going to say something that's going to make you mad, maybe. You are a traitor. I mean, seriously, you were somebody that took up guns against the federal government. You fought the United States of America in a war, and you lost. That's a pretty big thing. If you and I today were to pick up guns and fight the government, we'd be killed, we'd be thrown in prison, we would be traitors. So think about that for a moment. Okay, so full pardon to anyone who takes a loyalty oath. I mean, I think most of us would agree with that, but at the same time, that's pretty radical. So, hey, whatever you did, So most of the leaders of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, the president, Alexander Stephens, the vice president, Robert E. Lee, all these guys, they're pardoned. Now, a couple of them stay in prison. Jefferson Davis would be in prison for almost a year before he's released. But generally speaking, they were all pardoned, full pardons, complete pardons, unconditional pardons. So the guys that had been in power are right back in power. This is non-punitive. This is not about punishing, in other words. Restore property. If the government took your property during the war, they're going to give it back, including those islands. That's a big deal. And, of course, this does not include voting for African Americans. African Americans are freed, but that's it. They're not citizens. This is referred to as presidential Reconstruction. It's Reconstruction led by the president, President Johnson. At the same time, the constitutional amendment is ratified. The 13th Amendment. This was something that Lincoln had actually written and got through Congress. This was an amendment to the Constitution that ended slavery in the entire U.S. So Lincoln really is the great emancipator, but this is what makes him the great emancipator. So it ended slavery in the U.S. Doesn't say anything about citizenship or voting. It just ends slavery. That's all it does. Now, up until 1865, we had a racial order in this country. If you were black, you were a slave. And if you were black and you weren't a slave, you at least didn't have any rights. So now that slavery is gone, some of the states like Georgia, Florida, Alabama felt the need to restore racial order without slavery. And they passed these laws called Black Codes. Basically, these were slave laws that have just kind of been slightly rewritten. So this restricted the freedom of African Americans. The harshest were in Mississippi, but Florida and Georgia had pretty rough ones as well. For instance, maybe only certain jobs that blacks could have. In many states, they wouldn't even allow African Americans to own land. They had to show, quote unquote, respect for whites. For instance, in Florida, African Americans had to salute any white person they came across. In Florida, by the way, I think the same in Georgia, the only jobs that African Americans could have were as servants or as farm workers. Basically, the same jobs they did as slaves. That's the only jobs they were allowed to have. They weren't allowed to vote. There was no interracial marriage. This is pretty tough. Now, imagine you were from the North or the West. Maybe you're from Ohio or New York. You fought in this war. Your dad died in this war. You know, we spent 5 years fighting this horrible war. To you, it looks like the South had not accepted defeat, that they were trying to make it where nothing changes. If you were from anywhere other than the South, you would have been furious at this. It doesn't mean, now most people in this country, unfortunately, were racist at this time, but nonetheless, you would have been furious at this. We're going to come back to that in a moment. Here's a political cartoon from the New York Times. Very famous cartoon showing an African-American lying on the ground. He's in a U.S. Army uniform. You can see the American flag lying on the ground. And stepping on his back are three groups of people represented by these three men. On the right, the shorter guy, that's a northern business owner. Because again, northern businesses made a lot of money from slavery because they got cheap cotton and other cheap goods. They liked slavery. So they want to keep African Americans oppressed. They want to keep African Americans working at very low wages and not voting so they can make a lot of profits. In the middle, he's supposed to look like a little bit like Nathan Bedford Forrest or Stonewall Jackson. He represents the slave-owning South. You know, he's got a big knife in his hand. He's got the CSA, Confederate States of America belt buckle. He's supposed to represent the former slave owners who also want to keep African Americans cheap and oppressed and not voting. Then you got the guy on the left who looks really weird. He almost looks like an ape. He's got a big club in his hand. What do you think he is? He represents Irish Americans. Irish Americans were recent immigrants who worked very cheap, and they knew that if African Americans moved to the North, that they might work even cheaper and put Irish Americans out of jobs. So some Irish Americans didn't want African Americans coming up north. But yet, why does he look like an ape? Well, Irish Americans used to be considered a separate race. Obviously, they're not, but they used to be considered that. And so what's funny about this image is that the cartoonist is criticizing racism, but yet, in regards to the Irish person, he is using racism. So it's a very complex image here. But anyway, it does show you that the attitude towards African Americans was very complex, and it wasn't only a Southern thing. There were other types of images as well. This is one from Harpers Weekly at the same time period, late 1865. Here you have Lady Liberty, which often represents America back then, saying, what about this person? Here you have an African-American veteran. He's missing a leg, and they're saying, what about him? Look in the background. You can see the voting poll, you know, the thing you put your votes in, saying, shouldn't this person who fought for this country be a citizen? Shouldn't they have the right to vote? So again, in this country, you can see we're having a debate about African Americans, which is really a debate about power. Who has power? This comes to a climax in December of 1865. By December of 1865, all the southern states are back in the Union. They've held elections to elect members to Congress, to the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate. And they elected people like the guy pictured here. The guy pictured here is from Georgia. His name is Alexander Stephens. He had been a member of Congress before the war. He voted to secede and became the vice president of the Confederacy during the war. I mean, in other words, he was a traitor. He was the leader of the rebellion. And yet, he's right back in Congress. Again, think about how you might feel about that if you were not Southern. These are the guys that started the war, the bloodiest war in American history. And here they are, instead of being in prison, they are in the U.S. Congress. You would have been furious. And not only is this about the war, but this is also about politics. In the South before the war, most white Southerners were Democrats. In fact, the Civil War was seen as a Democratic war. If you were anti-slavery in this country, you were, generally speaking, usually Republican. So by this point, it's a Republican president, it's a Republican Congress. Here's a bunch of Democrats showing up. So not only is this about slavery and the war, but this is also about Democrats versus Republicans. So there's politics involved here as well. But again, you can understand the anger. Now, to look at it on the flip side, to be fair, think about it from this point. Being a member of Congress is actually not easy. You have to know the law, you have to be educated, you have to, be able to solve complex problems. Most people can't do it, even today. And back then, when most people not only didn't go to college, but most people didn't even go to public schools, especially in the South, there weren't many people who could have done this job. The only people who were truly qualified for this were these former Confederate leaders. So in some ways, the South almost didn't have a choice but to re-elect these guys. But on the other hand, they should have expected the anger. Anyway, Congress was angry, and Congress decided that this is too lenient. This is too soon, that President Johnson is being way too lenient. So Congress decides to take over Reconstruction. And the first thing they do is they do not recognize people like Alexander Stephens. They say, you are not a member of Congress. You got to go back home. Your states, the southern states, aren't ready for this yet. We need more time. You guys need to show more changes than you've already done. Now, I have the word miscalculation. This was a miscalculation. People in the South should have recognized that sending people like Alexander Stephens would not have gone very well. But I have the question mark there. Let me tell you why. This is a poster you see here. You notice it says, the Freedmen's Bureau, an agency to keep the Negro in idleness at the expense of the white man, twice voted by the president, made law by Congress. And look at the image here. By the way, this is a poster that would have hung on walls like of courthouses and buildings. This is kind of like Facebook of its day, to get political messages out. And so even if you can't read, you can look at the image and see what's going on. You have U.S. Congress there, and look over to the left. Way in the background, you see this respectable white family, got a mother and a child, and the husband's out plowing the field, working hard. Below him, there's another white guy chopping wood, working hard. And look right in the middle of the image. A stereotypical racist drawing of an African American just lying there, not doing any work, looking for his government handout, looking for his welfare check. If I asked you, where is this from? Most students would say, usually the first answer is always Mississippi, maybe Alabama, maybe Georgia. But if you look really close at the very bottom line, you'll see it says Pennsylvania. This is from Pennsylvania. This is not from the South. Here is another image. Here you have Uncle Sam. He's got the voting box there. And then you have this white man. And on top of him is an African American. And the white guy is having to bear the responsibility, bear the weight of the black guy. On top of him is an Asian immigrant from China. On top of him is a Native American. And the cartoon is saying, this is so ridiculous. This is so silly. Why is the white guy on the bottom instead of the top? Why don't we go ahead and just put a monkey on it? You can see there's an ape getting ready to be put on top. This is from California. So again, a lot of people in the South said, hey, America, you guys feel the same way we do. And in many ways, they were right. Many people in this country were racist. But here's the big difference. The South started the war, and the South lost the war. And the rest of the country wanted the South to act defeated. Now, by the way, the South felt very much defeated, but they didn't appear that way to others. So we get into a period we call Congressional Reconstruction, sometimes known as, quote unquote, radical Reconstruction. This runs from 1866 until the end of Reconstruction in 1877. The guy you see pictured here is Charles Sumner from Massachusetts. If you took US 1, you might remember Charles Sumner. Charles Sumner was anti-slavery way back. He was beaten almost to death in Congress in 1856 by Preston Brooks of South Carolina. Well, Charlie is now back and he is ticked off. So he kind of leads the Reconstruction. So number one, they put the South under military control. And in a moment, I'll show you a map showing this. That sounds terrible. The reality is there weren't many people in the South militarily. The U.S. military, by the end of the war, had less than 10,000 soldiers. The U.S. South had 12 million people at this point. So there were 10,000 soldiers. Over 6,000 of those 10,000 soldiers were in Texas and further west fighting Indians. So we're only talking about maybe 4,000 troops in the entire South. So in other words, if you lived here, you probably never would have seen a U.S. soldier. Doesn't matter. Just the idea that you're back under military control would make you furious. The Congress also extended the life of the Freedmen's Bureau. Freedmen's Bureau is only supposed to last a year. They said, nope, it's got to last a lot longer. And they forced states to rewrite constitutions, to specifically get rid of slavery and to specifically say that they would never rebel again. In many ways, this is all completely understandable. But at the same time, you can also understand why white Southerners may not have liked this. By the way, here's a quick map of the military districts of the South. We here in Georgia, you can see, in fact, 3 is about where Bainbridge is. We were in the 3rd military district, us, Alabama, and Florida. Something else that Congress did pretty early on, they passed the first Civil Rights Act in American history, the Civil Rights Act of 1866. For the first time since the Bill of Rights, they tried to define civil rights. Again, what is a civil right? A civil right is the rights that all U.S. citizens have, the rights you have as a U.S. citizen. That's what a civil right is. And it said all persons, regardless of color, except Native Americans, because Indians won't get rights until 1924, but all Americans, regardless of what color you are citizens. You can own property, sue for it, testify, or whatever. This was vetoed by President Johnson, but it was overridden. When you're president, especially back then, you don't have a whole lot of power. Your main power is the power of war, what we call the bully pulpit. That means you can persuade people through your actions, and vetoing. Of course, back then you didn't have much media, so you didn't do a lot of persuading. We weren't at war at this point. So the only power Johnson really had was the power of vetoing. But if Congress overrides your veto, in other words, they ignore it, then you don't have any power. Johnson in the next year will veto 21 bills. He will be overridden 19 times. Johnson is pretty much out of power by this point. Congress is running the thing. The Civil Rights Act of 1866, by the way, became pretty much the 14th Amendment, which, and again, I'm keeping this very, very simple. The main point of the 14th Amendment is all born in the U.S. are citizens. It goes further because, again, it does define civil rights. Even the recent gay marriage decision by the Supreme Court used the 14th Amendment. So, again, it obviously gets more complicated, but very basically all born in the U.S. are citizens. So, therefore, this makes former slaves, because they were born here by this point, this makes them all citizens. Again, it doesn't affect Native Americans, but. So Carpetbagger is supposed to be a northerner that came down and ripped people off. Well, historians have actually studied carpetbaggers. It turns out there weren't really that many. Most of the quote-unquote carpetbaggers were actually people who were here before the Civil War. And most of them were pro-Confederate. Really, the reality is a carpetbagger is a northerner that you disagree with. The other term, scalawag, the term really means a farm animal of low quality. But by this point, it basically meant any white Southerner who sided with the federal government or with Republicans. So who would be a scalawag? Well, these are two examples of scalawags. One was Confederate General James Longstreet, who was best friends with Robert E. Lee, played a big role in the Battle of Gettysburg, amongst many others, considered one of the greatest generals of the Confederacy. But after the war, a former slave owner, but after the war said, look, we lost. We should respect the federal government. By the way, Robert E. Lee said the exact same thing. But people don't usually call Lee a scalawag because everybody likes Lee. So Longstreet was called a scalawag. He did become a Republican. But it doesn't make him any less of an American, any less of a Southerner. But most white Southerners were Democrats. Governor of Georgia during the Civil War, Joseph Brown, a very strong Confederate, but after the war, admitted defeat, became a Republican, and was called a scalawag. So again, this really wasn't about corruption. This is about political power. People in the South who resented Republicans and resented the federal government. However, the biggest story here, again, is race. The use of race to scare people for political means. I argue, I think I've said this already, I'll say it again. When you look around this country today, we have racial problems. Not as many as we used to have, but we clearly still have racial problems. I would argue that we can see these problems begun during Reconstruction. And this is an example of it. You know, scaring white voters into thinking that if African Americans are allowed to vote, that there will be quote unquote Negro rule, and they will be like a vampire. They'll come and destroy everybody. That Nat Turner fear. So what we start to see is a reaction, you know, because we're seeing Republicans come to power in the South. We're seeing African Americans actually voting and having some participation and you know, they're citizens now. And so, again, former slave owners, the people who used to be in power, you know, because remember, the governors, the congressmen, even some presidents, the Confederate generals, they were all slave owners. They had the power. Now they have to share that power with others, and they don't like it. So we see a white, Southern, elite reaction. Again, we're not talking about poor whites here. We're talking about the leaders, you know, the former Confederate leaders. And there is a real reaction to this. We see violence, vigilante groups. Vigilante means to take the law into your own hands. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan, which, by the way, the KKK began as a social group in Tennessee, an elite social group, just like they went to, you know, had a dinner club. But again, after a while, those Southern elites thought, well, hey, we don't like what things are happening. We don't like the federal government and what they're doing. We need to take matters in our own hands. Of course, that's what slave owners used to do. Slave owners were the law. They used to enforce their own laws. So they're just kind of doing what they used to do. So groups like the Ku Klux Klan, the Knights of the White Camellia, you know, there's a lot of these groups out there. It's funny when you watch movies today. They always portray, unfortunately, every white Southerner is racist, and they're all members of the Klan. And they always show Klan members as being these dumb hicks, missing teeth, and married to their cousin, and all this. But the reality was, poor whites weren't part of the KKK back then. It was the rich people, the people with power. In any situation, look at who has the most to lose. And that's usually going to be the person committing the crime. Unfortunately, the KKK was a secret organization, so we don't have a lot of records of them. However, in Athens, Georgia, records of the KKK were discovered, and including member lists, letters, minutes, you name it. And of course, it's exactly who you would think it was. It was the former slave owners, it was the sheriff, it was the mayor, it was the preachers, it was the guys in power. So this is, again, a white Southern elite. And look at this image from a newspaper. You have an African American, he's been shot in the head, he's dead. And below it, it says, 1 vote less. That's a person who's not voting. That's a person who can't make a decision. That encapsulates the power struggle of Reconstruction. This is what Reconstruction, this is what it devolved into. We see, but the difference is African Americans do fight back. We see race riots. African Americans begin to try to take control. But again, they really don't have much power. White Southern elites felt betrayed. They felt like, they've been accepted back in the country, and now they got to share power with people they don't want to share power with. So they do everything in their power to prevent blacks from voting. Intimidation, murder, burning down schools and churches, you name it. And they're going to be successful. White Southern elites are going to win. So here is a typical political cartoon. Actually, this is from a poster saying, this is what the KKK are going to do to anybody, including a carpetbagger from Ohio who tries to come down here and get blacks to vote. This is what's going to happen to you. Something else you sometimes hear about Reconstruction, that this was a period where African Americans had the majority and they ruled. It's actually not true. There were black majorities. South Carolina had more African Americans than white Americans. But for the most part, African Americans didn't have a lot of power. We do, however, see some black members of Congress. We actually see 2 black senators and 5 black representatives. They were all Republicans, by the way. A lot of people don't realize that we had black elected officials before the Civil Rights Movement, but there was a brief period where we actually did. However, it's actually surprising that there weren't more. In fact, it turns out African Americans voted in higher numbers than did whites at this point. A lot of whites felt like, well, my vote doesn't matter. And yet, we don't see that many black members of Congress. We'll never see a black governor. We'll never see a black president at this time. We never even see many black state legislators. There really weren't that many. But we do see some success here. Let's look at Georgia. Since we're in Georgia, let's look at the state of Georgia. Again, was there ever black majority rule here? No. But we do see some African Americans make it. If you're a Republican, these 2 guys right here are the founders of the Georgia Republican Party. On the left is Henry McNeil Turner from Macon. He was actually the son of a slave. His father was a slave, but his mother was free, which meant he was born free in South Carolina. He actually wasn't supposed to, but he had learned, he was a janitor in a law office. So he learned to read, he learned the law. Then he became a preacher, and that's why he came to Macon, Georgia. But he also knew the law, he knew how to read. So he was convinced to run for the Georgia state legislature, and he won in 1868. The guy on the other side is Tunis Campbell, originally from New Jersey. He came to Georgia through the Freedmen's Bureau. He lived in Brunswick, Georgia, so over on the East Coast, directly east of Bainbridge. So right there at Sapelo Island and St. Simon's Island. But he lived in Brunswick. He also knew how to read. He knew the law. So he was convinced to run for office, and he won. In 1868, he had over 100 members of the Georgia state legislature. 38 of them were black. So it wasn't a majority, but hey, about a quarter of them were black. Then, summer of 1868, Georgia was fully accepted back into the Union. Congress said, yes, Georgia, you did what you're supposed to do. You rewrote your constitutions. You held fair elections. You're back. The moment that happened, all the black members of the Georgia state legislature were physically kicked out, literally thrown out the door. Henry McNeil Turner, ended up just leaving Georgia. He ended up moving to Ohio, and he never came back. Tunis Campbell actually went to Washington, D.C. to protest, but President Ulysses S. Grant wouldn't meet with him. When Tunis Campbell came back to Georgia, he was arrested for corruption. We know today that those charges were trumped up. In fact, the guys who arrested him later would admit that they made it up. He was arrested, thrown into prison, and became a member of a chain gang for a couple of years, basically a slave. When he was freed, not surprisingly, he moved back to New Jersey. There were also some other attempts to fight back. There was a legislator from Albany, Georgia, who decided to lead a protest march. Because again, this wasn't just about race. These were the Republicans that were kicked out. And again, stop and think about it. These guys were legally elected to office, and they were kicked out. So, in Albany, there was a big Republican rally, and they decided to march from Albany, Georgia, down to Camilla, Georgia. And this was black and white. When they got to Camilla, about a 20-mile journey, when they got to Camilla, they started giving speeches, and then some of the people in Camilla, more than likely former slave owners, those people, started shooting. They killed several people. The crowd dispersed. People were running in the woods, running away. Some made it back to Albany. Some left Georgia. Some were killed. Some we don't know what happened to. It's known as the Camilla Massacre. And it was reported throughout the nation. It was a shocking event. What you see here is a letter from the National Archives, because the U.S. government had to investigate. Because, of course, there's supposed to be military control. How could this happen under military control? And so there's complete documentation for this. But officially, we don't know who did this. Because everybody said, yes, I saw it happen. Who did it? I don't know. So no one was ever punished for this. By the way, to be fair, Georgia was not the only place this happened. Events like this happened throughout the South. But this was the first one, and it did happen in Georgia. So you see there is this physical, political power struggle going on in Reconstruction. Also in 1868, there was a campaign for governor. One of the candidates was John B. Gordon, a former Confederate general. He later would go on to found military schools. Gordon College here in Georgia is named for him. He was a pretty big player. But in 1868, he was running for governor. He was also the KKK leader in Georgia. He loses to Rufus Bullock. Rufus Bullock was later called the Carpetbagger because he was indeed from New York City. But he came to Georgia in 1851. 10 years before the Civil War. And during the Civil War, he was a good Confederate. In fact, he ran the railroads for Georgia. Everybody liked him. But after the war, this guy, said, hey, Democrats are out. They lost the war. Republicans are the main party. I'm going to become a Republican. And to get elected, obviously, I got to be nice to African Americans because they vote. I mean, that's what a good politician does. So he's elected to office. But Democrats are furious at him. Now, the Camilla Massacre, I forgot to mention this. One of the results of the Camilla Massacre is that Congress said, hey, Georgia, you're not done yet. Clearly, you're not supposed to do this. So Georgia was back on the bad list again. So Rufus Bullock, nothing happened to him for 3 years. In 1871, though, Georgia had been a good boy, and so Congress brought Georgia back into the Union. Georgia was considered reconstructed. And when that happened, Rufus Bullock, who was in the governor's mansion, by the way, today the capital is in Atlanta, Georgia. It used to be Milledgeville. Rufus Bullock is the guy who moved it from Milledgeville to Atlanta, by the way. So he's in the governor's house in Atlanta, and late one night, he is paid a visit by a couple of people. John Gordon, probably one of them, a couple other KKK members. They had guns, and they said, Rufus, you got two choices. You can either stay governor, but you won't live to see the morning, or you could resign and go back to New York City and live. So good old Rufus ran to New York City. And in his place, they had a special election since Bullock abandoned his post, and had a special election, and James Smith was voted governor of Georgia, and he would be reelected a couple of times. Another former Confederate general. Now, by the way, James Smith was not part of that gunplay, and James Smith seems to have been a pretty good governor. But in 1871, Georgia pretty much ended Reconstruction. In other words, guys like Gordon, here he is, who will eventually become governor of Georgia and also a U.S. senator, people like Gordon and James Smith, former slave owners, Confederate leaders, are right back in power. Democrats are back in power. The Confederates are back in power. And under these guys, African Americans don't get the vote. African Americans don't have any rights. In other words, Reconstruction is over in Georgia, and it was a failure. So Georgia stops Reconstruction in 1871. Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, the Carolinas, Virginia, they all do the same thing in the next couple of years. In 1868, the country was furious at Georgia for the Camilla Massacre. In 1871, nobody cared. So we can't just blame these guys for the problems. We can also blame the federal government. Because in 1865, 66, 67, the federal government very much cared about people in the South. By 1871, 1872, they had moved on. So, again, hopefully it's clear. What's the real struggle here? It's not really North versus South. Not really. It's not even really black versus white. Race is clearly part of this, but it's really not about black versus white. These guys like John Gordon, James Smith, they didn't care about poor white people. They cared about their own power. So again, the real struggle was money and political power. In other words, those who had been in power, keeping their power. It was Southern elites versus the federal government. And again, who's caught in between? Who pays the price? Poor African Americans who weren't getting much education, who weren't brought into the Union, who really, they weren't allowed to, so this is going to perpetuate problems for 100 years. Problems, I argue, we can still see today a little bit. Also, poor whites. The South will remain backward. The South will remain poor throughout the 20th century. And again, we can see these problems going all the way back to Reconstruction. It was a missed opportunity. And it's a tragedy for the South. As a Southerner, I can really get angry when I think about this. A couple other things that happened before we're done. I know we're at an hour already, so I'm going to try to. I lied when I said this would be short, didn't I? Sorry. And it'll be done in a few minutes. We're almost done. One more constitutional amendment was passed, the 15th Amendment, 1870. Because even though African Americans were considered citizens now, which meant the males should have been allowed to vote, a lot of African American men were not allowed to vote. So the Constitutional Amendment made it clear all U.S. citizens who are males can vote. So this is supposed to clarify everything. Now, as I said, the enthusiasm for Reconstruction was waning. In other words, it was going down. Again, 1865, the country is furious at the South. They're ready to make things better. By 1875, who cares? The country's moved on, even though the problems have remained. And it happens all the time. Problems arise. People say, we need to do something about it. Then a few months later, they forget about it. And the problem remains. Same thing here. One of the reasons why people quit focusing on Reconstruction is that we did hit a depression. 1873, we get a pretty bad depression. People are out of work. Things like Reconstruction quit being a concern. But there were a few things that happened. 1871, there was a Civil Rights Act. The Civil Rights Act of 1871, often called the KKK Act. It officially outlawed the KKK. But to be honest with you, the KKK was kind of done anyway, because they had gotten what they wanted. People were back in power. 1872, sometimes it's considered the last truly free election. Other than in Georgia, African Americans did vote in 1872 freely, but they would never be allowed to vote again until 1968 in any major way. That's really kind of shocking when you stop and think about it. 100 years after Reconstruction before we get full civil rights again in elections. And then 1875, we get the last Civil Rights Act until the 1960s. This outlawed segregation, meaning splitting people by race. That might be shocking. You think, well, wait a minute. They outlawed segregation in 1875. Why are we talking about Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement and Malcolm X and Selma, Alabama? Well, because even though Congress passed it, nobody paid attention to it. And in 1883, it was declared unconstitutional. By the way, a little backstory to this. Charles Sumner is the guy who wrote this law. He was from Massachusetts. He was Mr. Reconstruction, and nobody cared. He kept trying to get it passed, and nobody cared. Everybody's like, shut up, man. We're tired of hearing about this stuff. Move on. Well, if you ever are a member of Congress and you're trying to get a bill passed and you can't, here's my advice. Die. If you die, they'll pass it. This has happened over and over and over again. Charles Sumner died, and so everybody in Congress said, all right, we got to do it for Charlie, and they passed the bill. That's the only reason it got passed, was because the guy died. And again, obviously nothing happened, and we still have major problems. So how did Reconstruction really end? I mean, it was pretty much done already, as you can tell, but how did it actually end? Well, it ended with an election. In 1876, we're holding another presidential election. Anthony Johnson was president until 1868, and that's when Ulysses S. Grant, the U.S. Army general, is elected president. He's reelected in 1872, and so now he is stepping down, and so we're holding another presidential election. These are your two major candidates. On the right with the beard is Rutherford B. Hayes. On the left, the guy without the beard, that's Samuel Tilden. The guy without the beard is a Democrat. The guy with the beard is a Republican. The election is held. There's a lot of corruption in this election. And it's a tie. There's no clear winner. And the votes are tied up in places like Florida and Louisiana. Louisiana was so corrupt at this point that there's not much that could have been done. So all the political leaders came to Florida to try to work it out. And the leaders of Florida said, okay, we will vote for whichever candidate gives us the best deal. And what Florida wanted was, they wanted the military to go home. And again, there were only a couple thousand left. They wanted a Southerner appointed to the presidential candidate, and they wanted to improve railroads in the South even more. Samuel Tilden, the Democrat, Southerners tended to vote Democrat, he said, I don't think I can do that. That doesn't seem right. The Republican, Rutherford B. Hayes, said, I'll do it. So Rutherford B. Hayes, a Republican, is elected to president by Southern Democrats. That's why you got this image of Rutherford B. Hayes riding to office on a Democratic donkey. That's the joke here. And so this is called the Compromise of 1877. So Reconstruction, which was violent, corrupt, ends not with a victory, but ends with a dirty, corrupt backroom deal. And so Reconstruction officially ends. So struggle's over. Civil War's over. Reconstruction's over. This lecture's almost over. Who won? Who lost? Elites, Southern and Northerner, they clearly win. But who loses? Let's really think about that for a moment. Here is a map of the United States, looking at people living in poverty. The red and the dark red, the brick red, those are the worst states. Look at where most of them are. The South. And the poorest states, Mississippi, Louisiana, the heart of the South. The only other states that come close are New Mexico and Arizona, and that's only because of Mexican immigration. A lot of immigrants come over very poor. If it wasn't for immigration, those states would not be that. It's the South. Again, the poorest part of the country is the South. And in fact, where we are right now, Southwest Georgia, we're the poorest part of Georgia. You can trace that poverty, the lack of education, the lack of money. You can trace this all the way back to Reconstruction. Southern leaders were so focused on maintaining power, maintaining racial segregation, maintaining their free, cheap labor force that didn't pay any attention to public education, to building factories, to improving the South. And this would doom the South to poverty for decades. And also maintain racial problems for decades that we're still paying. I mean, again, this affects you and I, this history right here. So, okay, let's recap very quickly. Reconstruction. It started in 1865. It ended with the 1877 Compromise. And it did succeed on some things. Let's be clear. There was a peaceful transition from the Confederate States of America back to the USA. In other words, the war really did stop. Public works, roads, bridges, railroads, telegraph wires. Oh, those were rebuilt. Great. In fact, the South comes out better. For a brief period, we do see free elections. So in the short run, yes, it succeeded. But in the long run, it failed. There was no real racial equality. Much violence, not war, but much violence towards African Americans and black and white Republicans. And there was no lasting civil rights. All the civil rights that were gained during this time period all went away.